Hi and welcome back. Today we will be building your first web application and we will actually get to write some code. So to start things off, I will begin by re-downloading Agile Toolkit once again. It's pretty similar to what we've done in the last video, so if you have any questions with setting up, go back to the previous video, rewatch it once again. And while you watch this video, I recommend that you move it to the side and try things on your own. Just follow the same steps I'm doing, and if you do get stuck anywhere, then you should click on the forum over here where you can post questions to other users who are using Agile Toolkit. All right, so my download has finished. Then establish some sort of folder. For me, it's a folder called sites, where I keep all of my different projects. And once Agile Toolkit is downloaded, I'm going to expand this, open this up, and move this folder in here. Next, I will name my project Hello World, because that's going to be our first application. First project we will be building in Agile Toolkit. Then I will run this and drag this folder inside. Okay, so Agile Toolkit is up and running. The next thing, if you remember, was Atom, so I'll just have to click open and locate the folder of Hello World. Okay, so from if you remember, the Agile Toolkit installation contained two files, index.php, which is the default file, which is seen here right now. The second one was called admin, and this one is too complex for us right now, so I'm going to delete it and we'll revisit it later on. I would like also to organize my project so that I could store the lessons, multiple lessons. So I will create a new folder called step 1, and I will move my index.php file into this folder. Now, of course, if I refresh this page, it says that the index.php file is now missing. So in order to locate it again, I'll have to add step 1 over here. This is a standard PHP error. Get used to seeing them as you type the code, because you will inevitably make errors in your code and you have to understand how to read them. So it's important that it shows the file, which line, and then what happened. So it attempted to, the require command gave us an error, and it gives us a bunch of clues over here. So read everything carefully. Even for now it looks like gibberish. You will start to understand this later on. In this particular case, the problem is that I have moved this file, but it depends on some of the libraries installed through a thing called Composer. You see this Composer over here. Again, we will look into that later on. But for now, what we have to understand is that here's this folder vendor, and in here there's a folder called autoload. And the way how this require works, you specify the relative path to this file. But because we moved index.php into a subfolder, the relative path needs to change as well. We need to instruct PHP to go up one folder and then inside vendor, which is not seen in here, but you can see it on inside Finder. It's being hidden here. Okay, so once I save that and refresh this page, this is working again. Next, I will delete all of these things over here. This is a comment. So any place inside your inside your application, you can write comments. This is how they look. So you start with this, and this is how you finish. You can also put 2 slashes at the beginning and write comment. Now, comments are really important, and most of the beginners whom I get to interact with, who learn PHP, they never leave any comments, but this is important. Try to learn how to leave comments, and definitely add them inside your application. Let me actually talk about this part over here. So when we're using reverse commas or apostrophes like that, this indicates a string. So anything which is inside is the we call it a contents of the string, and you'll see there are 3 strings in our application over here. So we use it over here, over here. Anything that is not a string, it is typically a part of what we call a statement. So that's our first statement, which ends with a semicolon. That's a next statement. You have a semicolon here, and that's the third statement. So our application, if you look at it, consists of 3 statements. I have a diagram over here. So that's a reflection of our application. Statement, statement, statement. But then let me also talk about interaction between the user, so head over here, and the application itself. When I open this application and hit refresh, and notice that the stuff underneath there is gone, when I'm hitting refresh, the browser sends requests to my app. The app executes all the statements one by one and then presents me with a result of this execution. So what exactly is a request and when request happens? And the first case is when a user clicks a link anywhere, and that generates the first request. The second one, when user wants to refresh something, either hitting this button over here, and sometimes you'll see buttons on the page which perform a partial request, so only refreshing a portion of the page, not the whole page. The next type of request is when you fill out the form and you click the submit button. The browser will actually take that data and send it off to the application. And finally, sometimes there might be some events. For instance, on Facebook, when you click the like button, it doesn't refresh anything, it doesn't take you anywhere, it doesn't send any data, but it generates a request anyway using JavaScript. So these types of requests, we're going to call that they are caused by event. Now, for all of these requests, the application have to respond, and often it needs to respond in different ways. The most typical type of response is when application sends us back HTML. We're going to not call it by HTML, we're going to call it user interface, because you saw some of the buttons over here, and this is the application layout around it. When you're causing the refresh, the application will send you partial HTML, so not the whole bit, but just the area which needs to be refreshed. And the application can also send a redirect. So if you're opening one page, you can be redirected to another page. So you will see in the URL that you're trying to open one location, and suddenly you are redirected into another. And finally, the backend, the application can also respond with some action, and the action could perform things like changing the color of the button, or maybe changing the text somewhere, and it involves a little bit of JavaScript, but we're not going to call it JavaScript, we're going to call it action. Okay. Moving on to plan for this lesson. So I already have touched on require and what it does, and we looked at the statements and strings, but there are more things, and I will be going one by one while we will be writing a small application over here and then watching it, how it progresses in the browser here. These lines, I'll leave them for now. So add a comment here. Okay, and I will begin by adding new lines to explain to you what variables are. But before that, I will create some way to interact with the user. So you see, because the only way how application can respond to us is by providing a user interface, we need to add some sort of UI element, a button perhaps. And then using this button, we can convey some of the information of what's actually happening inside the application to ourselves. so we can test things. Okay, so here I'm adding button. I'll get into the actual syntax of this a little bit later. And it creates a button, and the button has a label called hello world. Now, if you remember, this is a string, but we don't have to specify over here. We can actually create a variable and then specify a variable instead of the string. All right, we're refreshing this page and you see it actually has a new label. So that's how we work with variables. The next thing I wanted to explain to you are operators and actually variable types. So the type of this variable is string because it contains a string, but it can actually can also contain a number. So I have number 2 and then you have number 3. So let me explain to you what I'm trying to achieve here. I defined 3 variables. The first one is greeting containing a string, and then A and B variables which contain integers. So they are now numerical values. And then since they are numerical values, I can add them up and this will result in number 5. Now I want to update my greetings variable by taking its previous value, and this dot over here is the operator for gluing several pieces of string together. So we'll go hello, semicolon code, and then there will be a space. So you pay attention to spaces. Spaces are important in programming. And then it will say result is column, another space, and then it will be glued to the result of addition operation. And you can see the result over here. Okay, so moving on, we have talked about operators. Next, we'll have to talk about objects. So this is the first example of an object. When we create, this is operator new, and here we specify a thing called class. So in terms of, if you think in terms of types, you get string, you get integers, but sometimes you get a complicated type, which like app. All right, so app is a special type of value, and this value we call object, but the type itself we call class. So the app is a class that's a representation of our web application, and we pass the name of the app when we create it. And then in the line number 7, we are invoking a method of this object, and then object does something additionally to what it already had done. Okay, and in here again we're using the app variable and we're invoking a method of this, and this particular method will add a new piece of the interface inside our application. I also have to mention that all the methods, so when we invoke a method like that, it responds with a return value, which we can store inside another variable like this. So, okay, so we have object app, which will create a button object with a specified label, which will then be stored inside the button variable. And we can actually work with this button variable to further modify our button, and now our button is red. Okay, so the very simple code is pretty self-explanatory once you understand. You have to be careful about what you're placing inside those variables, and you need to keep track on the return values of these methods, and then you're good. All right, so let me show you how we can add a second button. I'm going to use the same code as this one. We'll add another button which will be called test, All right, and if I refresh the page, you'll see two buttons side by side. Okay. Next, okay, moving back to the list of things I have to explain. Objects, methods, we've done that. Let's talk about properties. Apart from invoking methods, so I told you about the variables, how you can define variables. Well, object itself can define a variable inside it, and we can modify it with a syntax like this. So the icon is a special variable for a button, but we're only changing this icon variable for a second button. So that line will affect only the second button, not the first one. So these things are called properties. And finally, return values. Again, we talked about that. And this concludes all the basic statements. So obviously there are more types, and I'll show you and introduce you to them later on. For now, we're not gonna need them. So that's absolute minimum. In my next video, I will look inside control structures, because not all applications go step by step. Sometimes you need to make decisions, and the path of execution can actually change.